The human brain is a pattern recognition machine driven by reward, effort, and meaning. At the heart of its reward circuitry lies dopamine, a neuromodulator that doesn't just make us feel good, but teaches us what to pursue, what to remember, and what to value. Or our phone, checking a message or showing up for someone is deeply influenced by a reward prediction mechanism that lives in the brain. Central to this process is dopamine, a powerful neuromodulator responsible for motivation, anticipation, and reinforcement learning. But there's a critical truth we often overlook. The reward system does not simply respond to what is present or easy, it responds to scarcity, effort, and delayed gratification. When you are too available to others, you unintentionally remove these key ingredients from the neural reward equation. Let's examine this through the lens of neuroscience. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway, especially the projections from the ventral tegmental area, VTA, to the nucleus accumbens, is highly sensitive to cues associated with effort and novelty. When something is difficult to attain, whether it's a goal, an item, or even a person's time, it creates a heightened state of motivational salience in the brain. In simple terms, the brain perceives that thing as more valuable, more rewarding, and more worthy of pursuit. This isn't emotional speculation. This is how dopaminergic neurons respond to perceived effort, rarity, and challenge. Now, apply that to human relationships. If you are constantly replying instantly to every message, always saying yes, always showing up without hesitation, you are conditioning the people around you to associate your presence with predictability and ease. But here's the twist. The reward system downregulates its response to predictable and easily accessible stimuli. This is called neural adaptation. The same mechanism that causes you to stop noticing the hum of an air conditioner or become bored of a song after a few listens also causes others to take your constant availability for granted. It's not because they don't value you, it's because you've trained their brain not to. When someone has to wait for you, when your time is rationed, when your energy is allocated carefully, their brain registers that scarcity, and scarcity signals value. The very anticipation of your presence or response leads to a dopamine rise, which strengthens memory, increases emotional association, and ultimately enhances how people perceive you. This phenomenon is backed by the reward prediction error theory. When outcomes are better than expected or arrive after effort, the brain experiences a larger dopamine spike. Conversely, when something is always available, there's little room for error, no element of surprise or anticipation, and the brain responds accordingly with flatlined motivation. There's also a social dynamic rooted in evolutionary biology. In ancestral environments, access to a tribe leader, a skilled hunter, or a high-value member was limited. This wasn't out of arrogance. It was based on survival prioritization. High-value individuals were focused on mission-critical behaviors, protection, strategy, and leadership. Their limited availability wasn't selfish, it was signal-based. It indicated importance. Modern brains are still wired this way. When you make yourself scarce, you signal that your time and attention are directed toward meaningful pursuits. And that signal triggers respect, interest, and even admiration. On the other hand, overavailability often sends the opposite signal, one that you're underutilized, lacking purpose, or overly eager to please. This perception forms rapidly and subconsciously. The amygdala, responsible for threat detection and social appraisal, quickly codes these patterns, and people begin to form lasting judgments not on what you say, but on how you allocate your attention. The paradox is powerful. By always being there, you make people subconsciously feel like your time has no cost, and anything without cost becomes forgettable. Even romantic and friendship dynamics reflect this reality. Early in a relationship, when responses are slower and effort is required, emotional intensity peaks. That intensity, again modulated by dopamine and oxytocin, isn't about love or chemistry alone. It's about uncertainty and reward seeking. When that effort disappears and availability becomes constant, the emotional system shifts from engagement to habituation. You can see it in friendships that fade, relationships that lose spark, or careers where you burn out from overcommitment. The common thread is an unregulated loop of availability, that robs your presence of its power. When you structure your time and interaction patterns around intentional absence, you activate the mechanisms that fuel respect, desire, and long-term connection. The goal is not to manipulate others, it's to work with the brain's natural architecture. You're not withholding to create drama, you're creating mental space for your value to be recognized. Just like scarcity increases the value of gold, your selective availability increases the neurological and emotional value of your presence. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine driven by reward, effort, and meaning. At the heart of its reward circuitry lies dopamine, a neuromodulator that doesn't just make us feel good, but teaches us what to pursue, what to remember, and what to value. And here's where the first shift in thinking must occur. Dopamine is not released primarily when a reward is received. It's released in anticipation of the reward, in the pursuit, in the striving. The more uncertain or scarce a reward is, the more dopamine is released, and the more compelling that reward becomes. This principle is foundational in neuroscience and is directly applicable to how we manage our presence and availability in life. When someone is always present, always reachable, and always says yes, they are removing the brain's most powerful reward stimulant, unpredictability. If people always know where to find you, when you'll respond, and how you'll react, there is no gap in their brain that creates the kind of anticipatory tension dopamine thrives on. And this lack of psychological distance leads to a drop in perceived value. You become part of the background, like white noise that no longer registers. Familiarity might breed comfort, but from a neurological perspective, it also breeds desensitization. The mechanism responsible for this is called neural habituation. When the brain is exposed to the same stimulus repeatedly without variation or resistance, it begins to filter it out. Think about walking into a room with a strong scent. At first, your brain is alert to it, but after a few minutes, the smell disappears from your conscious awareness, even though the molecules are still in the air. This same process happens with people. If your availability is constant, others' brains begin to ignore the uniqueness of your presence. The person who was once exciting, important, or valuable becomes just there, not because they are less important, but because their presence no longer signals effort or scarcity. Now contrast that with a situation where someone's time is limited, where they don't always answer the phone, where they respond with intention rather than impulse. The brain interprets this as meaningful. The unpredictability, the challenge, and the scarcity all trigger a rise in dopamine because the reward, that person's time, attention, or validation, is now perceived as uncertain. The act of waiting activates the prefrontal cortex to maintain attention and the limbic system to amplify emotional weight. That's why we tend to think more about people who are harder to reach or who take longer to respond. Our own brains assign them more value, not because they did more, but because they created the perception of meaning through limited access. This is not about playing games or manipulating others. It's about aligning with how the brain is naturally wired. When you are too available, you're essentially telling other people's brains there is no need to invest effort here. The less effort required, the less reward the brain registers. That's why luxury brands limit supply, why elite athletes train in obscurity, and why leaders often remain deliberately hard to reach. Scarcity creates psychological gravity. Availability, if unregulated, creates the opposite, emotional lightness, or worse, invisibility. Additionally, from a behavioral psychology perspective, we must acknowledge the law of diminishing returns. The first time someone does something for you, it feels impactful. The 10th time, it becomes expected. The 100th time, it loses meaning altogether. If you're always accessible, the returns others feel from your presence shrink, not because you're giving less, but because their expectation has adjusted. They've adapted to your constant yes, and what the brain adapts to, it stops valuing. This cycle leads to misalignment, where the person giving more ends up receiving less appreciation, less attention, and often less respect. There is also a deeper biological cue involved, one related to social status and evolutionary signaling. Historically, individuals who were always available were not the ones making critical decisions or leading tribes. Leaders, visionaries, and creators had limited bandwidth. Their time was protected, and people waited for their attention. This model signaled that they were focused on higher order goals. That signal, once received by others, prompted respect and curiosity. In today's world, this signal still functions in the subconscious. When you create boundaries and become intentional about where your attention flows, others begin to respond to you differently. Their tone shifts, their posture changes, their level of engagement increases. You've activated a neural framework that tells them, this matters.